At 34 minutes past 11 on Christmas morning, a telephone in an apartment outside Dallas dialed 911, and the dispatcher who answered it heard almost nothing at all. There was breath on the line, a shape that might have been a word. She asked whether the caller was sick. She asked whether they needed an ambulance or the police. She said hello, twice, into a silence that would not answer her, and the line stayed open for roughly 30 seconds, and then it closed. 3 days later, in a room at the Grapevine Police Department, an investigator fed that same recording through a different piece of software, and a voice rose up out of the noise that nobody had been able to hear the first time. It was not a plea, it was an announcement. It was a man, whispering, telling the emergency operator exactly what he was doing, in the present tense, while he was still doing it. The man whispering into that phone was wearing a Santa suit. If you want to understand how completely a family can be taken apart by one person, you have to start with that recording, because everything else about this case was hidden the same way, in plain sight, audible if anyone had known what they were listening for. The dispatcher had done nothing wrong. Grapevine police would say so later, and they would mean it. What she heard, live, on a landline on the 25th of December, 2011, was a faint, raspy sound and the suggestion of the word help. That was enough. She sent officers to the address the line was registered to, an apartment in the 2500 block of Hall Johnson Road at a complex called Lincoln Vineyards, and they were pulling into the parking lot about 3 minutes later. They knocked. Nobody came. They tried the door and found it locked. And when they finally forced their way in, they discovered that every door and every window in the apartment had been locked from the inside. The living room was decorated. There was a tree. There were presents that had been opened and paper scattered across the floor where people had let it fall, the way it falls in every house in America on that particular morning. 7 people were in that room, 4 women and 3 men, ranging in age from 14 years old to 59. Some were still on the couches, others were on the floor. None of them had survived. One of the responding sergeants had been with the Grapevine Police Department for 12 years. He said afterwards that he did not think anyone on that department had ever encountered anything like it, and certainly not on Christmas Day, in a town that calls itself the Christmas capital of Texas. The geography of this is almost unbearable. Grapevine is a town of about 50,000 people, 20 miles northwest of downtown Dallas, close enough to the airport that you can hear the planes. On one side of that apartment complex there is a brown fence. Directly beyond the fence is Colleyville Heritage High School, consistently rated one of the best schools in the entire North Texas region, the school Nona had graduated from 7 months earlier, and the reason families moved to those streets in the first place. People choose that zip code because it is safe. That was the word neighbors kept reaching for the next morning, the day after Christmas, standing in the parking lot in the cold asking reporters what had happened, because nobody had told them anything and there was nothing to see. No broken glass, no damage, a sliding glass door and a set of blinds. From the outside, one apartment at the end of a building looked exactly like every other apartment at the end of every other building. There were 2 handguns on the floor. That detail is where the case became complicated, because for a short while the people investigating this scene were not sure how many attackers they were looking for. 2 firearms, 7 people, a door locked from the inside, and no sign that anyone had forced their way in. And one of those guns was not lying on the carpet at all. It was in the hand of one of the men who had died. His name was Mohammed Hossein Zarai, and he was 59 years old. And to anyone walking into that room cold, the arrangement of the scene said something very specific. It said, "This man did this. Look where the weapon is." It took forensic science and a few days to prove that the room was lying. Before any of that, though, before the ballistics and the residue tests and the recovered whisper, there were 7 names. 6 of them belonged to people who should still be alive. It matters more than anything else in this story that you know who they were before you know what was done to them. Fatemeh Rahmati was 55 years old. Almost everyone called her Nazreen. She had been born in Iran, and she had married a man named Azizullah Yazdanpanah in 1987. And together they had come to Texas and built a life in Colleyville, a comfortable suburb between Dallas and Fort Worth, where people move because of the schools. She raised 2 children in that house, She was, by every account given by the people who worked beside her, quiet, generous, and almost impossible to provoke. A friend described her as a peacemaker. Another friend, a woman who owned a beauty salon in Plano and had known her for years, described Nasrin and her older sister together as the nicest people in the world, angels, and then said something that captures how far this reached. The Persian community is devastated. The older sister was Zoreh Rahmati, 58. A woman who had worked for her in the 1990s remembered her as one of the most beautiful people she had ever known, inside and out. Zoreh's husband was Hossein Zoreh, and the two of them owned and ran a place called the Cedar Canyon Dude Ranch, down in Lancaster, south of Dallas. It was not a small thing in their world. It was a gathering place, a venue, somewhere the Iranian-American families of North Texas came for celebrations, and Hossein was well known because of it. Their daughter was Sahra Zoreh, 22 years old, a pre-med student at the University of Texas at Arlington, which is to say she was 3 or 4 years from being a doctor. Her boyfriend had taken her to see Christmas lights 2 days before. He said afterwards that Christmas was her favorite time of year. He said she left us happy. Then there were the 2 children. Nona Yazdanpanah was 19. Her full name was Nargis, but nobody used it. She had graduated from Colleyville Heritage High School that May, 7 months earlier, and she had enrolled at a local community college with a plan that she talked about openly: transfer to a school in California, then law school. She wanted to be a lawyer. Her father had once volunteered at a high school debate tournament where she competed, and the neighbors who saw him there thought, reasonably, that they were looking at a proud dad. A woman who had been present at Nona's birth said, in the days afterwards, that Nona was a tiny thing and that she had love for everyone, and then broke off and said, "You can't imagine what we're going through right now." And Ali Yazdanpanah was 14, a high school freshman, the baby of the family. A friend who grew up alongside both children said that they had all been as close as siblings, that they called each other brother and sister, that they were everybody's best friend. Those are the 6. The 7th person in that room was the man who had married Nasrin 24 years earlier. Aziz Yazdanpanah, 56 years old, born in Iran, known to his neighbors in Colleyville simply as Bob. He is the reason all of this happened. And the strangest and most difficult part of this case is that almost nobody who knew him saw it coming, and some of them still do not entirely believe it. He had a reputation on his street as an outgoing man. One neighbor said that if you saw him, he would say hi to you and everything, that he seemed actively engaged with his kids. Another neighbor, whose daughter had gone to school with his, said flatly that Bob loved his kids, and that she could not even fathom that this was what had happened. Underneath that, though, there was a version of him that his children knew and the street did not. Aziz had been the provider. That was the identity he had built and the one he held on to, and for a stretch of years in the 1990s and 2000s, he worked in real estate and mortgages and carried the household on his own. He had also forbidden his wife to work, despite the fact that Nasrin held a state cosmetology license, a qualification that could have brought money into the house at any point he allowed it to. That is not a small detail. It is the whole architecture of what came later. He had built a house where he was the only door money could come through, and then he lost the ability to hold the door open. The cracks were showing early. In 1996, he pleaded guilty in federal court to 1 count of subscribing to a false income tax return, and he was placed on 3 years of probation, fined, and ordered to pay restitution. The sums were not enormous. For a family already stretched, they were heavy enough. That same year, he bought a 9mm pistol and registered it in his own name, and it stayed in his possession for the next 15 years. By 1999, he and Nasrin filed for bankruptcy together. It was discharged within months, and on paper the crisis passed, and in reality it was the beginning of a long slide that never reversed. The final break came around 2007, when he left the mortgage business. He did not go into another one. According to Nasrin's own brother, Aziz was effectively unemployed for something close to 12 years, and the phrase that brother would later use to describe him, trying honestly to explain rather than to condemn, was that he had no future. So the door he had been guarding closed. And the woman he had forbidden to work went out and got 2 jobs. at 2 different spas, one of them in Southlake, and started carrying the household herself. You can hear what that did to him in the way his friends describe him. One of Nasrin's friends, the salon owner, put it in one line: "She worked hard to keep the family together, but he wasn't willing to do anything." Neighbors noticed the tension in the house without being able to name it. For a man whose entire sense of himself was built on being the one who provided, watching his wife carry the weight instead was not a relief. It was a humiliation that arrived every single day in the form of her paycheck. And the money still was not enough. In August of 2010, Nasrin filed for bankruptcy on her own. Her attorney later explained what she had hoped it would do: stave off the foreclosure of the house in Colleyville, the house the family had lived in for more than a decade. It did not work. The filing was eventually dismissed because she could not keep up with the planned payments. A bank foreclosed on the property, a 3,000 square foot home that had most recently been valued at more than $300,000, and it was sold at a foreclosure auction, and Aziz went on living in it anyway. That is the picture that has to be held in mind for everything that follows. A large suburban house, in one of the better zip codes in North Texas, that no longer belonged to the family living in it. There were stretches where the power was off. There were stretches where the water was off. And there were 2 teenagers inside it trying to get through a school year. Their uncle noticed. He would later say that the children were not doing very well at the time when they were all living together, and he would say it carefully, because he was a doctor and a brother, and he had watched this from 4,000 miles away and had not been able to fix it from there. His name was Dr. Ali Rahmati. He was an orthopedic surgeon in London, and he was the only brother of Nasrin and Zoreh, and he is the single most important living person in this story, although almost no one outside Texas has ever heard his name. Because when Nasrin finally decided to leave, it was Dr. Rahmati who paid for it. That decision took her 24 years. It came, by her own account to the people around her, from exhaustion rather than drama. Her lawyer at the time remembered how firm she was about the terms, and remembered one instruction in particular, which she repeated with an emphasis that has aged terribly. Please don't talk to the husband at all. In the spring of 2011, she moved out. Police would later place the separation in March. The family friends who helped remembered the move happening in April. Either way, by that spring, Nasrin had taken Nona and Ali and left the Colleyville house, and moved 2 miles down the road into an apartment at the Lincoln Vineyards complex in Grapevine. Her brother in London fronted the money that made it possible. Her sister Zoreh helped her buy the basics to fill the rooms, because there was no money for anything beyond basics, and because Nasrin did not want to fight. A friend described her approach in a way that says everything about what she was navigating. She didn't really want to make him angry. Aziz stayed in the foreclosed house on his own. And here is the thing that makes this case so quietly frightening. From the outside, nothing looked wrong. Neighbors across the street in Colleyville did not know that Nasrin and the children had moved out at all. They had seen the family at a garage sale together only months before. They had seen him at the school. They saw a man who waved. Meanwhile, 2 miles away, the 3 of them were doing something that looked a great deal like recovery. Nona finished high school and started college, and told people about California. Ali went into his freshman year, close enough to walk. Nasrin kept both spa jobs and brought homemade food in for her coworkers, which is the kind of small, unremarkable generosity that people only tell you about afterwards, when it is the last thing they have left of someone. Her colleague at the Southlake Spa remembered her turning up and working through days when she was clearly unwell, because the shifts were the household now and there was nobody else to take them. Zoreh was close by throughout. The 2 sisters had always been close, and after the move Zoreh was in and out of that apartment constantly, helping her younger sister put a home together out of almost nothing. Sahra and Nona were cousins the way some cousins are, which is to say barely distinguishable from sisters. Sahra was deep in her pre-med coursework at Arlington. Nona was working out transfer credits, 2 young women in their early 20s, in the same family, both aiming at professions that take a decade to reach. It was, by any measure anybody would apply, a family that had come through the worst of something. But that autumn there were signals, and they were being sent to people who had no way to read them. One of Nona's friends said that in August, Nona had told her that things were getting harder, and then had stopped short and never explained what she meant. Nasreen went to the management of her apartment complex and told them, in plain language, that she was afraid of her husband. A co-worker later told police that Nasreen had confided that Aziz was not coping with the divorce that was coming. None of those signals reached each other, a frightened woman told a leasing office. A teenage girl told a classmate half a sentence. A tired mother told a colleague at work. Nobody was collecting them because nobody knew there was anything to collect. What was happening on the other side of those 2 miles is harder to see because the man at the center of it left no note, no diary, no explanation of any kind. What exists instead is a police file, opened up later under public records law, full of the things his friends told detectives afterwards, once it was too late for any of it to be useful. He was, in his own telling, the wronged party. He believed his sister-in-law Zoreh had turned his family against him. He told one friend that she controlled his wife and his children, that they listened to her, and that she had described him to them as evil. He believed his brother-in-law Hossein had betrayed him too, over private conduct on trips the two men had taken, conduct their wives had not known about, which Aziz believed Hossein had eventually confessed to Zoreh in a version that made only Aziz look bad. Whether any of that was true is almost beside the point. He believed it, and he nursed it. There were older grievances too, aimed at his daughter. A classmate of Nona's described a level of surveillance at home that had been going on for years, her phone taken and her call history and messages checked, rules about what she could wear, a rule that she could not date at all until a certain age, and then only within their own background. The same account described cameras installed around the house and Nona's bedroom window nailed shut so she could not get out at night. Those details come from one friend, speaking to reporters in the days after, and they have never been independently confirmed. They are worth stating carefully for that reason. But they match the shape of everything else. Nona had a relationship her father disapproved of, and she had kept it hidden from him, and she had been right to. One neighbor in Colleyville had a nickname for him. It came from a conversation in which Aziz had mentioned carrying a gun because of trouble he was having over his daughter's boyfriends. The neighbor started calling him Packing Heat Bob and told it as a joke, the way people do, for years. On Christmas Eve, the extended family gathered at the Cedar Canyon Dude Ranch in Lancaster, the place Zoreh and Hossein owned. It was a proper party, the kind that place existed for. Friends came. There was food and there were children and there was music, and it was the last time a great many people in that community ever saw any of them. Photographs from that night would go into a slideshow 6 days later, though nobody in the room could have known it. Nasreen was there with Nona and Ali. Sahra was there. Zori and Hossein were hosting, because they always hosted. It was the first Christmas since the separation, and by every account it was a good one. The sort of evening where a family that has been through a bad year notices that it is still a family. Aziz was not there. Whether he had been formally uninvited or had simply not been asked is a distinction his friends argued about afterwards. What is on the record is that he had told at least one friend in advance that he intended to be at the family's Christmas gathering and that he was subsequently made aware that he would not be welcome at it. That friend used a phrase to detectives that has followed this case ever since. He said it may have been the straw that broke the camel's back. So on the 24th of December, while every person he had ever belonged to was gathered under one roof 40 miles to the south, a 56-year-old man sat alone in a foreclosed house in Colleyville and knew exactly where all of them were. The following morning, the 25th of December, the plan was small and domestic. Nasreen was hosting in her apartment. Her sister Zoreh, Zoreh's husband Hossein, and their daughter Sahra drove over. Nasreen's children were home. It was a first Christmas in a new place, after the worst year of her life, and she had made it happen on 2 spa salaries and her brother's help. That brother called her that morning. Dr. Rahmati would say later, publicly and specifically, that he spoke to all 6 of them by phone from London on Christmas morning. 6 voices. His 2 sisters, his brother-in-law, his niece, his nephew, his other niece. A normal call, on a normal holiday, made across 5,000 miles because he was a man who stayed close to his family even when his work kept him on another continent. He would also say that in 30 years of visiting he had never seen a sign that Aziz might be dangerous. Aziz had a key to the apartment. He came by often to see his son. There had been no threats and no warnings. Just a man who had run out of money and out of standing, and in the doctor's later words, out of future. There is one small disagreement in the record here, and it is worth being honest about it, because it is the only place where the family's account and the police account do not quite line up. Investigators believed Aziz had already arrived before some of the extended family got there. Dr. Rahmati, speaking days later, said that when he made his call, Aziz was not in the apartment. It is a difference of minutes, not of substance, and it changes nothing about what followed. But it means the doctor's memory of that morning is a memory of his family alone together, 6 of them, before anyone else walked in. Whether that is a mercy or the opposite is not for anybody else to decide. What is not in dispute is that he had the key regardless, and that on that particular morning, he did not need it. Sometime before 11 that morning, Aziz drove from Colleyville to Grapevine, parked his sport utility vehicle near the building, and went to the door. He was dressed as Santa Claus. He said he had come to surprise the children. Nazreen let him in. She had spent the whole year avoiding making him angry, and this was Christmas morning with her sister's family in the room, and so she did what she had done 100 times before, which was to keep the peace and open the door. Nobody in the apartment was pleased to see him. We know that because his niece Sahra had her phone out and was texting a friend, and those messages survived. Just before 11 she wrote, "So we're here, we just got here, and my uncle is here too, dressed as Santa, awesome." The sarcasm is unmistakable. It is a 22-year-old rolling her eyes at an awkward family Christmas, and it is one of the most ordinary sentences ever entered into evidence. At 11:15, she sent another one. Now he wants to be all fatherly and win Father of the Year. That is the last thing anyone in that apartment said to the outside world. Investigators later concluded that everything happened inside a window of roughly 16 minutes. Presents were opened, the paper was on the floor, there was no sign of a struggle beforehand, no argument that anyone heard through the walls, nothing that read as escalation. Police said afterwards that there had apparently been no sense of danger in the room at all. He had come in with 2 handguns and nobody knew. The first anyone outside knew of it was the call at 34 minutes past 11 from the landline in that apartment, and the dispatcher who could not make out what she was hearing, and the 3-minute drive, and the locked door. For most of that first day, the public knew almost nothing, and so did the investigators. 7 people, no names. On Sunday evening, officers were going carefully through a sport utility vehicle parked outside the building, and the vehicle came back registered to a man who did not live at that address. On Monday night, they searched the house in Colleyville and carried out a computer and several bags. The Tarrant County medical examiner did not release the names of the 7 until Tuesday afternoon, which meant that for the better part of 2 days, families across 2 continents were waiting on a list. There was one more thread that the department mentioned publicly and then declined to explain. Aziz, they said, had prior dealings with at least 2 other police departments, though not with Grapevine. They would not say what kind, or when, or how many times, only that they were working with those agencies. Nothing further was ever released about it, and it remains one of the loose ends of this case. A man with some history somewhere, in a state where none of it stopped him buying or keeping a firearm. Now go back to the 2 guns on the floor, because this is where the case turned. The first weapon was a Smith & Wesson 9mm, the one he had bought back in 1996 and registered in his own name. The second was a Glock, a .40 caliber. Neither had been reloaded. There was still ammunition in both. 6 people had been shot with the same gun. 1 had not. Hossein Zareh, the brother-in-law, the man Aziz believed had betrayed him, was struck 4 times by rounds from both weapons. Several of the others had defensive-type wounds on their limbs, the kind of injuries that tell an investigator someone raised their arms. And the 9mm, the gun registered to Aziz, was in Hossein's hand. For a short time, that mattered enormously. Police did consider the possibility of 2 shooters. It is exactly what the scene was designed to suggest. The forensic work took it apart in pieces. The first piece was fingerprints. The 9mm in Hossein's hand had none on it at all. Not Hossein's, not anyone's. A gun does not arrive in a man's hand wiped clean. Somebody put it there deliberately and took the trouble to remove the prints first. The second piece was gunshot residue. Aziz had residue across his hands, consistent with a person who had fired a weapon repeatedly. Hossein had only trace amounts, at the same level as the other victims, consistent with a person who had been near gunfire rather than a person who had produced it. The third piece was the ballistics, which put both weapons in the same hands, and the fourth piece was the recording. On the Wednesday after Christmas, Grapevine police ran the 911 audio through different software and heard what the original playback had never given them. A lieutenant with the department was careful to say publicly that the newly discovered audio had not been audible on the original system over many playbacks, and had not been heard or understood by the dispatcher who took the call. That was not a criticism of her. It was a defense of her. On the enhanced recording there are two things. In the background, faint, someone saying help, and then, at the end, close to the phone, a man's voice, whispering, saying that he was shooting people. It was Aziz. He had made the call himself. He picked up his estranged wife's landline in the middle of what he was doing, dialed the emergency number, and narrated it in a whisper, and hung up. Then he placed one of the guns in the hand of the brother-in-law he resented. Then he took his own life, and the medical examiner would rule that his death was self-inflicted, while the 6 others were not. He was found near the front door. Police called it premeditated. He had arrived at a family gathering he had been told he was not welcome at, in a costume, with 2 loaded firearms, and left a scene arranged to point somewhere else. There is not much ambiguity in that sequence. What there is no answer for, and never will be, is the interior question, and the sergeant who spoke for the department for that whole week never pretended otherwise. He said they really did not have a clear idea of why he did it. He said sometimes there is not a really good explanation for irrational behavior. He said he thought the man had probably been overwhelmed when it was all said and done. And in a separate moment he said the thing that has stayed with people in that town longer than any of the forensics. We think he was just inside there celebrating Christmas with the rest of them, and decided, for whatever reason, that's how he's going to end things. The rest of the story belongs to the people who were left. On the Wednesday evening, 3 days after, friends from Nona and Ali's schools organized a candlelight vigil at Parr Park in Grapevine. It was not a police event or a city event. It was teenagers, doing the only thing available to them. Friends, neighbors, and relatives stood together in the cold. Someone sang Amazing Grace. White balloons went up into the dark. A longtime friend of the family spoke there and said she had taken a call that morning from relatives back in Iran who were frightened of something very specific, that there would be nobody in America to mourn them properly, that their people would go into the ground among strangers. She told them nobody's going to forget them. The 6 were buried privately on the Thursday. On the Friday, about 500 people came to the Cedar Canyon Dude Ranch in Lancaster, the ranch Zori and Hossein had owned, the same place where the family had celebrated on Christmas Eve 6 days earlier. Persian food was served. Poems were read in English and in Farsi. A slideshow ran. People had decided, deliberately, that they would spend the day on who these 6 had been, rather than on how they died. Aziz was not honored at that gathering. His name was not part of it. And in Iran, where 2 of them had been born and where family still lived, another memorial was held at the same time, for people most of the mourners had not seen in years. Dr. Ali Rahmati found out the way strangers did. He was in London. A headline crawled across the bottom of a television screen. 7 people, west of Dallas. He knew immediately that it might be his family, because he had spoken to them that morning, and because he knew exactly which apartment they were in, and because he was the one who had paid for it. He flew to Texas, and he spoke publicly that week, and the things he said are the last word this case deserves. He said that in 30 years he had seen no warning. He said the motive, as far as he could understand it, was that Aziz had been out of work for 12 years and had no future, and he pointedly said that it had to do with money and family circumstances rather than with religion, or with being Iranian, or with conservative culture, which mattered enormously at the time, because there were people in the days after this who were already building a very different and much uglier story out of the same facts. The brother of the 2 women who died refused to lend it to them. He said he did not hate his brother-in-law. He said it without performance, standing in a country that had just taken his entire family from him. He used the platform for one request, and it was directed at Washington rather than at any individual. Please change the gun law. And he described what he had left in a sentence that does not improve with retelling. He said it had really affected his life, because he had 3 sisters and now had only one, in Iran. And then, about the young women, he said the 4 words that end this story in most people's memory of it. Nieces. He had none left. Then he said the other thing, the one that people who have survived something like this always seem to arrive at eventually, because there is no alternative. You have to move forward. That's life. I don't think you can go backward. There is no cold case here. There is nobody who got away with it, no wrongful conviction to overturn, no laboratory breakthrough decades later, no arrest to wait for. The file closed almost as soon as it opened, which is its own particular cruelty, because it means there was never a courtroom where any of these 6 people got to be spoken for. What is left instead is a set of very small objects, a Santa suit, wrapping paper on a carpet, 2 text messages from a 22-year-old who thought she was just enduring an awkward morning, a community college application with California written on it, a ranch in Lancaster where 500 people ate Persian food and read poems in 2 languages because nobody could think of anything else to do, and a telephone. 2 calls went out of that apartment on Christmas morning. The first was the one that came in from London, from a man who had made sure his sisters and their children had somewhere safe to go, checking in on all 6 of them because that is what he did every year. The second was made an hour or so later, from the same room, by the man who took them, and it said almost nothing that anyone could hear. It took 3 days and better equipment to recover what was on that second call. It has taken far longer for anything to be recovered from the first. Dr. Rahmati still has that morning. 6 voices on a line, on a good day, in a new apartment, with the presents not yet opened. He is the one who still has to carry it. But some things do not come back.